to get ahead of this. And so I'm glad to talk to you because, and this is your introduction, because you were there at the very beginning of like you were the impetus, or at least you were seemingly the impetus of the indie game boom, right? With the indie game documentary. 2008, 2009, it was like the glory days. And now I'm talking to you at a point where the game industry, in my opinion, is at like its weakest in like 20 years. Is that correct?
Maybe longer than that.
Yeah.
I've was talking to some other developers who, I hadn't exactly thought too hard about how bad is the current crash, right? But I've heard people express that it's the worst state that games has been in. And here I'm speaking of the whole industry, like indie plus AAA and all that. It's the worst place it's been in since like the Atari video game crash of the 1980s, if you even know what that is.
I don't.
So
know.
When I was a little kid, I was like, probably 7 years old or 8 years old, and my parents got a home game console back when there were not very many things that could be described that way, and it was the Atari 2600 game console, although the one we got was like an off-brand one sold by Sears or whatever. But, kind of like an old Nintendo or whatever, you'd put a cartridge in and the game would boot up instantly, unlike many games today. And, these cartridges were like, $20 in 1980s money or whatever, which is, you can at home whip up your own inflation calculator to figure out what that is today. But, they weren't totally cheap.
Yeah.
And so, games went into this boom because this home console market was a new thing that blew up. And the games weren't that hard to make because the graphics were so terrible, Yeah. Like that's where most of the effort in a modern game goes, is like into graphics.
Yeah.
And so you just kind of had to program something that would plausibly be a game, and you could sell it at the store and all these people would buy it. And so over, I don't know how long it took. There's this guy, Digital Antiquarian, who makes really good, he does really good write-ups about various periods in video game history and various games and stuff. And I'm pretty sure he did one about this time. But over a course of a few years, it went from totally new market to very successful. Everybody loves the games. And then tons and tons more people are making the games, right? And then, of course, the games became so low quality, and simultaneously, while that's happening, while the quality of games is dropping, like the novelty wears off, right? So the market sort of shrinks from everyone who wanted like a short-term cool new thing, which is maybe a large percentage of the population, down to like people who are serious gamers, in the 1980s. And that's a big cut in the audience. And so very quickly, over the course of like a year, it went from booming industry to like a horrible, horrible, horrible bust. So I just remember as a kid, I would go to like whatever the store was, on the next block over. It was just like sold general kinds of stuff, but they sold video games there because that's what happened. And they had like a giant barrel of game cartridges for 25 cents each. And they were just like, please, please, please buy some of these and get them out of our
So this
store.
was at the tail end of the bust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was hyped as a kid that I could get all these games for 25 cents, but it was not good for the industry, right?
Yeah.
And so right now is probably something like that. You hear about all these games. There have been very high profile games that come out and like literally nobody buys them, right?
Yeah.
But for every one of those, there's all sorts of, to get back to indies for a second, there's all sorts of indies who worked for years on something, and then, they release it and 10 people play it and that's it,
Yep.
And so it is a very hard time. It is the hardest time that I have ever been a professional in the games industry.
That's crazy.